So you have a new post out about growth today. What are the most surprising trends you're seeing?
Well, we're seeing trends that are projecting towards 2018. Some of it is, you would anticipate, like major travel to places like Japan, Tokyo, and Osaka, and Paris. But what's really, really interesting is we're seeing major travel in what has traditionally been called the flyover areas and also in emerging economies. But you look at our recent report, it shows almost over 250% growth in places like Indianapolis, Indiana. And I think what that really speaks to is the network effect of the platform as it spreads out and more people use it. But those are also places that have traditionally been a little bit underserved in terms of the traditional accommodation options. Hard for those hotels to justify a build out there. And when you have things like the Indianapolis 500 or Big Ten football, the Big Ten football championship was in Indy last week, you see our platform just sort of spring to life. You're
also expanding in Asia, in Africa, in the Pacific. Yeah. What's been the biggest challenge?
I think, for us, it's just, the pace of the growth, right? I mean, that's a high-class challenge, by the way. And we just had our best quarter we've ever had, over 260 million people now on the platform. But, this growth is just taking place underneath us. And for us, it's, incredibly important that we make sure, it's working as well as possible for our guests and our hosts, because ultimately, over 60% of the people who use Airbnb do so based on the recommendation of a friend or family member. And I just came back from Jamaica, tough travel, I realize, but it was the UN had a conference on inclusive travel, how you can use travel as it becomes a bigger and bigger part of the global economy, 10% and growing pretty fast. How can you make sure that everyone is benefiting from it? And from a sustainability perspective and from an economic inequality perspective. And so a big part of what we talked about was by 2030, almost 60% of all travel is going to be taking place in these emerging markets. And how can we begin to do things now to make sure that entire communities are benefiting from it? And I think folks see us, given that we're making travel available and accessible to traditionally non-traditional areas where people travel to, as part of that solution. So it was really exciting, but it's an interesting thing to be having a conversation with right now at the front end of this whole trend.
You say you're focusing on sustainable tourism. What does that mean? How do you do that? Does it mean you don't put certain listings on your platform?
Great question. So if you look at the way our platform works, it has roughly a 65% less impact on carbon than a traditional hotel. I mean, one of the greatest contributors to climate challenges is cement. It takes an enormous amount of cement to build, traditional hotels. And so, our places are already built. They're places where people live. Also, about 90% of them are in non-traditional hotel districts. So people can actually travel there and get around by foot, get around by bike. Less water impact, less energy impact. And what you see from our survey data is that over 70% choose to use Airbnb because they see it as a sustainable option when it comes to travel. And in a time period when climate's going to become, it's one of the huge issues of our time, obviously. And with travel and tourism growing so fast, how can you make sure you're doing it in a sustainable way?
Any insight into whether Trump's policies on immigration is impacting international tourism?
It's a great question. I will say we haven't seen that yet. Now, we've been out front in terms of opposing the travel ban. We actually had a whole campaign called We Accept, which was really built around that. We haven't seen that in terms of actual travel and tourism. I do think it has profound impacts on the U.S. And I think where you potentially see that is, does the U.S. brand, as the home of the Statue of Liberty, right? Does that take a hit as a result of that? And then as a derivative of that, travel and tourism. I think it's growing so fast, I'm not sure that's going to be the case. But you do see the reverse of it in the following way, which is when I was in Jamaica, I had a number of countries that came up and wanted to talk to us about how we could work with them to make our data accessible, anonymized, to help inform their marketing, because they themselves are actually looking to diversify their travel, where they're inbound, where people are traveling from to go visit their countries. And they specifically were concerned about becoming overly dependent on the U.S. for travelers and wanting to diversify. And I think that is really being driven by some concerns about issues that are taking place over here in terms of how welcoming the U.S. is perceived to be.
You worked in the Clinton administration.
I'm an old guy.
We recently covered sexual misconduct of Shervin Pishevar, an investor at Airbnb, also a major Democratic Party donor, did give money to Hillary Clinton. What's your response to these allegations?
I think we believe what the women have said out there. I think we've gone through and I think it's been a long time coming, and it was very much needed. A pretty significant transition in the world, particularly in this country, in terms of people being willing to speak up and stand up on an issue that's been taking place for forever. And I mean, every day you read these stories, and just incredibly impacted by the courage of some of these victims, these women, to stand up and talk about these issues. And so obviously, it's not particularly hard to say. We condemn any of that type of activity. Certainly believe what the women are saying out there, but I think even more broadly, do see that we're now in the middle of a pretty significant transition in what social mores are and how people look at these and how people accept it, how the press covers it, how willing people are to talk about it and engage on it. And that's incredibly important if we're actually going to be able to address the underlying substantive challenges.
Airbnb had its own sexual misconduct situation in China. The head of Airbnb China left. As we understand it, he had a relationship with a subordinate. What actually happened there?
Well, I think, as you could probably guess, we just don't talk about HR types of issues, personnel types of issues. I would say that we are, generally speaking, broadly speaking, and we're not always perfect. We don't get everything exactly right. But we certainly do have a value system that we believe in strongly and seek to execute and act against those values.
Reporters are speculating that Airbnb will go public in 2018.
You never asked this question.
I'm
just absolutely shocked that you
I
would
know
ask
it's a
that
shocker.
question. I told you, when we know, you'll know.